In the early 1st century of the Common Era, Jerusalem was a city under permanent tension, politically dominated by Rome, religiously governed by a complex system of priestly authorities, scribes, and teachers of the law. The city concentrated, within just a few square miles, disputes over power, identity, and interpretation of Scripture. It's in this scenario that the historical figure of Jesus emerges, a Galilean Jew who circulated among villages, synagogues, and the temple, teaching and interpreting the law of Israel. The Gospels record, on more than one occasion, explicit attempts by religious leaders to stone him. In John 8:59, after a public debate, the text states that they picked up stones to throw at him. In John 10:31, the scene repeats, the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. These attempts aren't described as impulsive acts of disorganized violence, but as reactions that, in the eyes of those leaders, had legal and theological justification. To understand why these attempts occurred, it's necessary to suspend later devotional readings and return to the world of Second Temple Judaism. Stoning wasn't a random punishment. It was a specific form of execution prescribed in Mosaic law for crimes considered severe, especially those that threatened God's sovereignty over Israel. Texts like Leviticus 24:16 determine, "Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. The whole assembly must stone them." But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't about anger. It was about protocol. And that changes everything. The central question, therefore, isn't just why they wanted to kill Jesus, but why, specifically, by stoning. The method of punishment reveals how his words and actions were interpreted by part of the religious elite. It also reveals which boundaries could not be crossed without provoking an extreme response. Throughout this documentary, we'll analyze the episodes recorded in the Gospels, the legal context of 1st century Judaism, the functions of religious leadership, and the concepts of blasphemy, authority, and messianic identity. Only by crossing these elements will it be possible to understand why, at certain moments, the reaction wasn't just rejection, but an immediate attempt at public execution. The question has remained open since then. What exactly did Jesus say or do that was understood as such a grave violation of the law as to justify stoning? But before we can answer that, we need to understand who these authorities were. And what we discover about their power structure will completely change how you see this episode. To advance in this investigation, it's fundamental to identify who the religious leaders mentioned in the texts were. The Gospels use various terms: scribes, Pharisees, chief priests, and in some cases, simply the Jews, an expression that, in John's Gospel, usually designates authorities in Jerusalem, not the Jewish people as a whole. At the center of this system was the Sanhedrin, a council composed of high-lineage priests, elders, and law specialists. Although its authority was limited by Roman rule, the Sanhedrin maintained control over religious matters, internal discipline, and normative interpretation of the Torah. Picture this: 70 men, the most powerful religious figures in Judaism, meeting in chambers adjacent to the temple. They decided what was heresy and what was orthodoxy. They held the power of life and death over religious matters. Within this context, blasphemy was considered a capital crime. But the concept of blasphemy in 1st century Judaism wasn't restricted to direct insults to the divine name. It included actions or declarations that placed a human being in a position competing with God's exclusive authority. Later rabbinic literature, such as the Mishnah, preserves ancient debates on this theme, indicating that attributing divine prerogatives to oneself was seen as an extreme transgression. And here's where things get dangerous. Because Jesus wasn't just teaching. He was redefining boundaries. It's at this point that certain declarations attributed to Jesus become central. In John 5:18 after affirming that God was his Father in a singular way, the text observes, "For this reason, The Jews tried all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also called God his own Father, making himself equal with God. The accusation isn't of mere abstract heresy, but of equation. Another example occurs in John 10:30, when Jesus declares, "I and the Father are one." The reaction is immediate. The text says they picked up stones and justified the act with the words, "We are not stoning you for any good work, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God." John 10:33. From the authorities' point of view, the logic is consistent. The law was clear about the consequences of blasphemy. The question wasn't whether Jesus performed extraordinary acts or attracted crowds, but whether his words crossed the permitted limit of theological language. A teacher could interpret the law. A prophet could exhort the people. But a man who placed himself on the same plane as divine identity broke a boundary considered inviolable. These episodes show that stoning attempts don't emerge in a vacuum. They appear at specific moments of discourse when the language used by Jesus is perceived as a direct threat to the traditional definition of God and to the authority structure that derived from it. But there's something even more disturbing in this story. It wasn't just what Jesus said, it was how he said it. And that broke every rule in the system. Beyond the question of blasphemy, there's another decisive element: authority. In the Gospels, Jesus doesn't just interpret the law, he does so with uncommon autonomy. In Matthew 5, in the so-called Sermon on the Mount, this formula repeats, "You have heard that it was said, but I tell you." For modern readers, this structure may sound rhetorical. For first-century listeners, it had profound implications. The law wasn't individual property. It was transmitted through chains of authority. A teacher quoted another teacher, who quoted an earlier tradition. By speaking in his own name, without explicitly appealing to recognized authorities, Jesus positioned himself outside the expected standard. Mark 1:22 records that people were amazed because he taught as one who had authority, and not as the scribes. This is the moment where everything shifts. Because in that world, nobody spoke like this. Nobody. This authority also manifests in symbolic actions. The temple cleansing, narrated in Mark 11:15-20-18, is particularly sensitive. The Jerusalem temple wasn't just a religious space, it was the economic and political center of Judaism. Interfering with its functioning was equivalent to questioning priestly leadership. Imagine walking into the headquarters of the most powerful institution in your nation and overturning tables, scattering money, releasing animals. The text observes that, after this episode, the chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to kill him. Although the stoning attempt doesn't explicitly occur at that moment, the pattern is the same: a public action that challenges established structures and suggests superior authority. In historical terms, this helps explain why hostility grows progressively, culminating in immediate elimination attempts. Here's what makes this legally fascinating. Under Roman rule, formal executions required imperial approval. Stoning, however, could occur as a quick community action, especially if the crime was perceived as religious and urgent. The Book of Acts describes Stephen's stoning this way in Acts 7:58, suggesting this type of punishment was still part of the era's legal imagination. Think about what this means. Religious authorities couldn't formally execute anyone without Rome. But if someone committed blasphemy right there, in public, in front of witnesses, the stones came out fast. So when the Gospels report that leaders picked up stones, they're not describing just an emotional impulse. They're describing the application, or attempted application, of a known punitive mechanism legitimized by tradition and justified by a specific reading of Jesus' words. Up to this point, we've analyzed the biblical text and the historical context in which these events occurred. But now comes the fundamental question. Are we facing a literal claim within the biblical narrative or a symbolic construction understood in a specific way by the original audience? Leave in the comments how you interpret this question in light of the context presented, because what we're about to examine next reveals the deepest layer of this conflict. In the final stages of this analysis, it's necessary to recognize that there's no absolute consensus among historians about all the details of these stoning attempts. Some scholars see in John's Gospel accounts a more developed theological elaboration, in which Jesus' speeches are formulated to emphasize his identity. Others defend that such declarations reflect real debates of the period, preserved and literarily organized decades later. External sources to the New Testament, such as Josephus, don't directly mention stoning attempts against Jesus, but confirm the climate of religious tension and the rigidity with which certain deviations were treated in first-century Jerusalem. This doesn't invalidate the Gospel accounts, but reminds us they must be read as situated historical documents, not as literal transcripts of modern courts. But here's what we can establish with historical certainty. The mechanism was real, the laws were enforced, and the boundaries Jesus crossed were considered non-negotiable by those in power. What seems unavoidable is that, for a portion of religious leadership, Jesus crossed lines considered non-negotiable, whether through language perceived as blasphemous, through actions that insinuated authority superior to the temples, or through a combination of both. The extreme reaction finds explanation within the legal and theological system of the time. The Mishnah, compiled in the 2nd century but preserving earlier traditions, dedicates extensive discussion to what constitutes blasphemy. It specifies that pronouncing the divine name with full articulation could warrant death. But it also discusses cases where someone claims divine attributes or prerogatives. The debates preserved there suggest that first-century authorities operated with similar categories. What's particularly striking is the consistency of the pattern. Each stoning attempt in the Gospels follows a specific trigger, a declaration of identity, a claim of authority, or an action that symbolically usurps divine prerogative. This isn't random violence. It's systematized response to perceived transgression. The stoning attempt, therefore, cannot be reduced to personal hatred or simple misunderstanding. It emerges from a profound conflict about who can speak in God's name, how the law should be interpreted, and where human authority ends. And here's what makes this historically significant. This wasn't just about Jesus. It was about the entire framework of how divine authority operated in Second Temple Judaism. Think about the implications. If a man could claim equality with God and be believed, the entire system collapsed. The priesthood, the temple, the sacrificial system, the interpretive authority, everything depended on maintaining that boundary between human and divine. From their perspective, they weren't trying to kill an innocent teacher. They were trying to protect the very structure of their faith. Whether they were right or wrong is a question that has crossed centuries and remains open to historical analysis. But their logic, within their framework, was internally consistent. In upcoming episodes, we'll advance in this investigation and analyze how this theme was understood by the first Christians and how its implications crossed the centuries. If you want to follow this documentary series continuously, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. As we close, we return to the initial question. Why did religious leaders try to stone Jesus? The sources indicate that, in their eyes, it wasn't about silencing an inconvenient preacher, but about protecting the boundaries of the sacred as they understood them. If this interpretation was correct or not is a question that has crossed centuries and continues open to historical analysis. And perhaps it's precisely in this tension between text, context, and interpretation that lies the key to understanding not just this episode, but the entire lasting impact of Jesus' figure in history. Because what happened in those moments when stones were lifted wasn't just about one man. It was about the collision between two understandings of how God relates to humanity. And that collision echoes to this day.